Imagine a city with almost no land of its own, no mines and no great army, built on a foundation of mud and salt water, standing in a desolate, wind-swept lagoon. By all logic, this city should never have survived, let alone thrived. And yet, for 1,000 years, this impossible place was one of the richest and most powerful states in the world. This is the story of Venice. So how did they do it? How did this republic of merchants build a vast maritime empire? How did a city with no natural resources become the gateway between East and West? Tonight, we will tell the epic story of the Venetian Republic, La Serenissima. We will explore the genius of its shipbuilders. We will sail with its fleets into the heart of the Crusades. We will follow its merchants as they cornered the world's most lucrative trade in spices and silk. This is a story of incredible ingenuity and political drama. It is also the story of a slow, beautiful decline, of a city that was the envy of the world for centuries. But before we set sail, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, so I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of marble palaces, silent gondolas, and the scent of Eastern spices. The story of Venice begins not with a grand design, but with a desperate flight. In the 5th century AD, the mighty Western Roman Empire was crumbling. The prosperous world of northern Italy was being torn apart by barbarian invasions. The most terrifying of these were the Huns, who swept down from the east under their leader Attila, leaving ruin in their wake. As their cities burned, the Roman citizens of the region, the Veneti, had to flee for their lives. They sought refuge in the one place a horse-mounted army could not follow. This was the vast and desolate lagoon on the coast of the Adriatic Sea. It was not a paradise. It was a hostile maze of mudflats, saltwater marshes, and small shifting islands. But it offered one singular virtue: safety. The shallow, confusing waterways were a natural fortress. The first Venetians were refugees. They were fishermen, salt pan workers, and farmers who had lost everything. On these small, muddy islands, they began to build a new kind of settlement. Their new community was based not on the soil of the earth, but on the salt of the sea. But how do you build a city of stone on a foundation of mud? The Venetians developed an ingenious method. They drove thousands of long, sharpened wooden piles deep through the soft mud. They pushed them down until they hit a layer of hard-packed clay below. This created a dense, underwater forest, a solid and stable foundation. On top of these pilings, they would lay thick platforms of timber. Only then could they begin to construct the stone foundations of their houses, churches, and palaces. They were, quite literally, building a city on top of an upside-down forest. This unique and challenging environment forged a new kind of people. Their roads were canals. Their wagons were boats. Their lives became oriented entirely towards the sea. This daily struggle with the water taught them pragmatism and resourcefulness. The city that was born from fear was not destined to remain a humble refuge. It was poised to use its unique position to become a power in its own right. As the small settlements of the lagoon grew into a single, thriving city, the Venetians faced a new challenge. They were officially part of the distant Byzantine Empire, but in reality, they were independent. They needed a leader to unite them. However, Their history was one of fleeing the brutal tyrants and warring lords of the mainland. Their deepest fear was recreating the very system of one-man rule that they had escaped. Their solution to this dilemma was a political masterpiece, a system of government that would ensure their stability for 1,000 years. In the 8th century, they created the office of the Doge. The title came from the Latin word dux, meaning leader. The choice was deliberate. He was to be a leader, but not a monarch, a prince, but not a king. Critically, he was elected for life by the city's most powerful families. He was not born into the role. The office was a symbol of the state's continuity, but its power was limited from the very beginning. The true power in Venice lay with the wealthy merchant families. Their fortunes were built on maritime trade. Their greatest fear was that an ambitious doge could seize absolute power. A single ruler could create a hereditary dynasty, disrupting the commercial enterprise of the city for his own personal glory. The entire Venetian political system, therefore, evolved into a complex and ingenious machine designed to prevent this. The government was a republic, but it was not a democracy. It was a rigid merchant oligarchy. The foundation of this system was the Great Council. This was an assembly made up of the members of all the noble families of Venice. The Great Council was the ultimate source of authority. It elected the other, smaller councils that ran the city. The Doge himself became a kind of constitutional monarch, bound by an elaborate oath of office. The checks on his power were almost paranoid in their thoroughness. He could not name his own successor. His sons were forbidden from holding public office during his reign. His official mail had to be opened and read by state censors before he was allowed to see it. He could not even leave the city of Venice without the permission of his own councils. To further protect the state from internal threats, the Venetians created one of history's most famous and feared institutions, the Council of Ten. This was a small secretive committee that acted as a state security service. It was tasked with rooting out treason and conspiracies. Its agents were everywhere. Citizens were encouraged to anonymously denounce their neighbors by slipping messages into stone letterboxes placed around the city, the infamous Bocce di Leone, or lions' mouths. The Venetian system was a paradox. It was a republic built on a foundation of profound institutionalized mistrust. Yet this complex web of checks and balances was incredibly successful. While the rest of Europe was constantly torn apart by the ambitions of feudal kings, Venice enjoyed a stability that was the envy of the world. This stability allowed it to focus its entire energy on a single passion, the accumulation of wealth and the building of a great maritime empire. For the first few centuries of its existence, Venice was not fully independent. It lived in the long shadow of the greatest power in the Christian world, the Byzantine Empire. This was the Eastern Roman Empire. It ruled from its magnificent and fabulously wealthy capital, Constantinople. Venice was officially a Byzantine duchy. It was a distant and semi-autonomous province, a small part of a vast and ancient empire. This connection shaped the city's early character. Venice was a city of two worlds. It was geographically in the west, but its culture, art, and politics all looked to the east. The breathtaking golden mosaics that began to adorn St. Mark's Basilica were created by Byzantine masters, or in the Byzantine style. This deep connection to Constantinople gave the Venetians unique access to the most sophisticated markets and trade routes in the world. The Venetians were shrewd and pragmatic subjects. They used their relationship with the empire to their own advantage. Their growing navy, the best in the region, often served as a mercenary fleet for the Byzantine emperor. The emperor frequently needed help to fight off Norman and Arab threats in the Mediterranean. Venice provided this vital naval support, but it always came at a price. The most important payment came in the year 1082. The Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, was desperate for Venetian help against an invasion. In return for the service of their fleet, he issued an imperial decree known as a Golden Bull. This decree granted Venetian merchants staggering trading privileges throughout the Byzantine Empire. They were allowed to trade completely tax-free in most of the empire's major ports, including Constantinople itself. They were even given their own district and docks in the capital. This was a massive economic coup for Venice. It gave them a huge competitive advantage over their rivals, like Genoa and Pisa, but it also slowly began to cripple the Byzantine economy. The empire was now deprived of huge amounts of tax revenue. The relationship began to change. The Venetian servants were now becoming richer and more powerful than their Byzantine masters. Over the next century, this imbalance led to growing tension and resentment. The people of Constantinople grew to hate the arrogant and wealthy Venetian merchants, who now dominated their city's commerce. This hostility sometimes erupted into violent riots and massacres. The old alliance had curdled into a relationship of deep mutual suspicion and bitter economic rivalry. By the end of the 12th century, the bond was completely broken. Venice was no longer a servant, but a powerful and independent competitor. The Venetians saw the weakening Byzantine Empire as both a commercial threat and an immense opportunity for plunder. They knew the secrets of Constantinople's wealth, and they knew the weaknesses of its defenses. This long and complicated history of service, economic domination, and bitter resentment is the crucial backstory for the shocking events that were to come. As Venice grew in power and distanced itself from its old master, the Byzantine Empire, its leaders knew the city needed a new spiritual heart. A great power required a great patron saint, one whose prestige could rival the apostles of Rome and Constantinople. Their current patron was a minor Byzantine figure, a constant reminder of their former subservience. To be truly independent, Venice needed a relic of the highest order. And so they set their sights on the body of Saint Mark the Evangelist himself. There was just one problem. The sacred remains of Saint Mark were housed in a shrine in Alexandria, Egypt, a city then under the control of the Muslim Caliphate. In the year 828 AD, two Venetian merchants, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, embarked on an audacious and sacrilegious mission. Their goal was a holy theft, an act of pious larceny, to bring the evangelist home to their city. The two merchants sailed to Alexandria. Through a combination of bribery and persuasion, they convinced the keepers of the shrine to let them take the saint's body. They claimed they were saving the holy relic from potential desecration by the local rulers, giving their heist a veneer of religious duty. Their greatest challenge, however, was smuggling the body past the caliph's customs officials at the port. It was here that the merchants displayed the cunning and pragmatism that would come to define their republic. They placed the saint's body in a large basket and covered it with layers of pork and cabbage leaves. As the story is told, when the Muslim officials, who consider pork to be unclean, came to inspect the cargo, they recoiled in disgust. They waved the ship through without a proper search. The daring plan had worked perfectly. The arrival of St. Mark's body in Venice was a moment of profound transformation. The entire city erupted in celebration. No longer a cultural province of Byzantium, Venice was now a major pilgrimage destination. Its sacred authority could rival that of Rome itself. The magnificent golden St. Mark's Basilica was commissioned to be the new permanent home for the evangelist's remains, becoming the spiritual and political heart of the Venetian state. With their new patron saint came a new powerful symbol. The traditional icon for St. Mark the Evangelist is a winged lion. Venice immediately adopted this as its own. The Lion of St. Mark, often depicted holding a book, became the official symbol of the Republic. It was stamped on coins, flown on the banners of their warships, and carved into the gates of every city they conquered. The theft of a saint's body was the ultimate declaration of Venetian ambition. It was a sacred act of larceny that severed their old ties and laid the divine foundation for the independent empire to come. Venice now had a stable government and a divine protector. It also possessed a growing naval power, a fleet strong enough to be hired as mercenaries by the Byzantine emperor himself. But what was the source of this incredible maritime might? The answer, the true physical heart of the Republic, was forged in a single, vast, and highly secret location. Tucked away in the eastern corner of the city, behind high red brick walls and guarded towers, lay the Venetian arsenal. It was not merely a shipyard. It was the largest and most efficient industrial complex in Europe, centuries ahead of its time. The genius of the arsenal was its revolutionary approach to production. In an age where ships were typically built one at a time, the Venetians pioneered the principles of the modern assembly line. The process began with the mass production of standardized, interchangeable parts. Within the arsenal's sprawling complex, dedicated workshops were filled with highly skilled workers, known as the arsenalati. They did nothing but produce identical components: oars, rudders, masts, and vast quantities of rope. These parts were then stored by the thousands in massive warehouses, ready for use at a moment's notice. The assembly of a ship took place along a production canal that flowed through the heart of the complex. A bare, pre-built hull would be towed into the canal at one end. As it moved down the waterway, it would stop at a series of stations. At each stop, a different guild of specialized arsenalati would swarm the vessel. They fitted it with the specific parts they had mastered. One team would install the rowers' benches, another would step the mast and rig the sails. In the final stages, the ship would be armed, first with crossbows and later with the powerful new technology of cannons, cast in the arsenal's own foundries. This system was so astonishingly efficient that it was said a visiting dignitary, in a famous demonstration, witnessed a new war galley being fully assembled and armed in the time it took him to eat a leisurely dinner. At the peak of its power, Venice could outfit and launch a fully equipped warship in a single day. This incredible speed gave the Republic a strategic advantage that no rival could match. In times of war, they could generate a massive fleet almost instantly, stunning their enemies with the sheer scale and speed of their mobilization. The arsenalati who worked here were an elite and privileged class. They were state employees with guaranteed lifelong jobs, pensions, and even housing for their families. In return for this security, they were fiercely loyal and sworn to secrecy. They were the guardians of the state's most vital military and industrial secrets. The arsenal was a fortress, not just against enemy fleets, but against the prying eyes of rival powers. desperate to steal the secrets of Venice's industrial might. The arsenal was far more than a shipyard. It was the physical manifestation of Venetian ingenuity and pragmatism. It was the factory that allowed a small city, built on mud and salt water, to project immense naval force across the Mediterranean. The political stability of the Doge's palace provided the will, but the industrial might of the arsenal provided the weapon. The power forged in the dark halls of the arsenal was put on magnificent display for the entire world to see. This happened on one special day each year, the Feast of the Ascension. On this day, the city celebrated its most important and unique state ceremony. It was a ritual that perfectly captured the soul of the Republic. It was called the Marriage to the Sea. The centerpiece of the festival was the Doge's state barge, the Bucenter. This was no war galley. It was a floating palace, a breathtaking masterpiece of Venetian craftsmanship. The ship was immense, a double-decked vessel propelled by the arsenal's most skilled oarsmen. Its entire surface was covered in elaborate mythical carvings, all heavily gilded with pure gold leaf. When the Bucentaur was brought out of its special shelter, it was said to look like a golden mountain floating on the water. On the morning of the festival, the Doge would board the Bucentaur. He was dressed in his finest ceremonial robes, along with the highest officials and foreign ambassadors. From there, he led a grand procession of hundreds of boats out into the lagoon. It was a spectacle of incredible pomp and civic pride. The entire city would turn out to watch the golden barge, followed by a flotilla of brightly decorated gondolas and private yachts, the air filled with music, the pealing of church bells, and the cheers of the Venetian people. The procession's destination was the Lido Inlet. This was the point where the calm waters of the lagoon meet the open expanse of the Adriatic Sea. Here the flotilla would fall silent, and the Doge would perform the ancient and sacred ritual. He would take a consecrated golden ring. He held it aloft for all to see. Then he would recite the solemn, unchangeable Latin vow, Desponsimus te mare in signum veri perpetui que domini, which means, we marry you, our sea, as a sign of true and perpetual dominion. With those words, he would drop the golden ring into the waves. The act was a yearly renewal of the sacred contract at the heart of the city's existence. It was a prayer for the safety of their sailors and the prosperity of their trade. But it was also a powerful statement of political reality. It declared to the world that the Adriatic was Venice's territory. It announced that the sea was their private highway, and that they were its undisputed master. For the Venetians, this was no mere metaphor. Their city was born from the water, protected by the water, and made rich by the water. The sea was their farm, their fortress, and their entire reason for being. To be married to the sea was to state the fundamental truth of their world. This magnificent ceremony was the ultimate expression of the Venetian soul. It was a golden spectacle that proclaimed the source of all their power and glory. At the dawn of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III declared the Fourth Crusade, a new holy war to sail to the Holy Land and reclaim Jerusalem. The feudal lords of France and the Holy Roman Empire answered the call. They assembled a magnificent army of knights and soldiers. But to strike at the heart of Muslim power in Egypt, they needed a fleet. There was only one city in the world that could provide it, Venice. The leader of Venice at this time was one of the most remarkable figures of the Middle Ages. His name was Doge Enrico Dandolo. He was an old man, well into his 90s, and he was blind. Yet his mind was as sharp as any man half his age, and his ambition for the glory of Venice was boundless. The Crusader envoys arrived and made their request. They needed a fleet to transport 33,000 men and 4,500 horses. Dandolo and the Venetians drove a hard bargain. They agreed to suspend all their normal commercial activities for over a year. They would dedicate the entire industrial might of the arsenal to this one massive project. The price for this service was a staggering 85,000 silver marks. The Crusaders agreed and Venice went to work. In the summer of 1202, the Crusader army arrived at the Lido of Venice. A crisis immediately erupted. The army was far smaller than promised. Thousands of knights had taken different routes or dropped out. As a result, they could only pay a fraction of the enormous agreed-upon price. The situation was a disaster for both sides. A massive armed foreign army was now trapped on an island in the lagoon, unable to fulfill its vow. And Venice was on the brink of bankruptcy, its expensive new fleet sitting idle in the harbor. It was in this moment of crisis that the blind Doge Dandolo revealed his cunning genius. He made a proposal to the desperate Crusaders. They could, he suggested, pay off the rest of their debt, not in silver, but in service. Their first target, he announced, would not be Egypt. It would be the Christian city of Zara, a trading rival of Venice on the Dalmatian coast. The Crusaders were aghast. They had taken a sacred oath to fight the enemies of Christ. Now they were being asked to attack a fellow Christian city for the commercial benefit of Venice. Many protested this blatant hijacking of their holy mission. Some abandoned the crusade in disgust, but the majority, trapped in debt and desperate, reluctantly agreed. To seal the deal, the aged Enrico Dandolo performed a masterful act of political theater. During a great mass in St. Mark's Basilica, he declared that he, despite his age and blindness, would personally take the cross and lead the crusade. The great fleet, paid for with Venetian silver and Crusader desperation, finally set sail. Dandolo's great gamble had paid off. He had successfully diverted the entire Fourth Crusade onto a new, unforeseen, and controversial path, replacing its sacred purpose with the cold, hard logic of Venetian ambition. And so, in the autumn of 1202, the great Crusader and Venetian fleet appeared before the harbor of Zara. When the people of the city saw the massive armada, they were terrified. They were devout Catholics. They hung crucifixes and banners of the Pope from their city walls. They pleaded with the Crusaders not to attack their fellow Christians. The Pope himself had explicitly forbidden the act. He had threatened the entire army with excommunication, but the leaders of the crusade were trapped by their debt, and the blind Doge Dandolo was relentless. For Venice, this was business. The siege began. After a brief and brutal assault, the city of Zara fell to the Crusader army. The knights and soldiers, having now paid a portion of their debt and service, entered and sacked the city. It was a grim prelude to what was to come. The army wintered in the conquered city. It was during this cold, intense winter that the destiny of the crusade was changed forever. A new player arrived. He was a young, exiled Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos. He made the Crusader leaders a breathtaking offer. He asked them to sail to Constantinople and help him take the throne. In return, he would pay their entire debt to Venice. He would also finance their onward journey to Egypt and submit the Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope. For the French and German knights, This was a rightful heir and unite the church, all while solving their financial crisis. For the Venetians, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, was the wealthiest metropolis in the world. It was also Venice's greatest commercial rival. The chance to place a friendly, indebted emperor on its throne was a prize for which Enrico Dandolo was willing to risk everything. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the immense, legendary walls of Constantinople. The citizens of the world's greatest Christian capital were stunned to see a fellow Christian army at their gates. The initial assault was successful. The usurper on the throne fled. The young Prince Alexios was installed as co-emperor, but the triumph was short-lived. The new emperor quickly discovered that the city's treasury was empty. He was unable to pay the vast sums he had promised. Tensions exploded. The Crusader army, camped outside the walls, felt betrayed. They watched as a popular uprising overthrew their puppet emperor, who was brutally murdered. With no hope of payment, the Crusaders made a fateful decision. They would take their payment by force. In April of 1204, they unleashed a full-scale assault. The Venetian fleet played a crucial role. Their ships acted as floating siege towers, allowing them to storm the sea walls. After a desperate battle, the defenses were breached. The Crusader army poured into the wealthiest city in Christendom. What followed was one of the most shameful events in medieval history. It was the Great Sack of Constantinople. For 3 days, the city was subjected to an orgy of looting, destruction, and murder. Palaces and churches were stripped of their priceless holy relics and ancient treasures. The great library was burned. Magnificent bronze statues were torn down and melted for coin. Venice played a shrewd and calculated game in the division of the spoils. The French knights took land, but Venice took the prizes that mattered most for a maritime empire. They looted the famous 4 bronze horses, a future symbol for St. Mark's Basilica. They took control of 3/8 of Constantinople itself, and they claimed a string of strategic ports and islands throughout the Byzantine Empire, including the crucial island of Crete. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. It had, instead, shattered the ancient Christian Byzantine Empire. It had also enriched Venice beyond its wildest dreams. With the wealth of Constantinople in their vaults, and its most strategic ports under their control, Venice was no longer just a powerful city-state. It was now a true empire, the undisputed master of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the chaotic aftermath of the sack of Constantinople, the French and German Crusader lords scrambled to carve out feudal kingdoms for themselves. They claimed vast tracts of land from the fallen Byzantine Empire. The Venetians, however, played a much more calculated and strategic game. They had no interest in governing large, rebellious inland populations or managing feudal estates. Their ambition was not for land, it was for the sea itself. From the spoils of the fallen empire, they meticulously crafted a new kind of empire, one perfectly suited to a republic of merchants, the Stato de Mar, the state of the sea. While the other crusaders claimed their share in territory, Venice claimed its share in trade routes. Their strategy was to create a long, unbroken chain of fortified ports and islands. The sack of Constantinople had changed the world. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the heir of Rome, a bastion of Christianity and wealth in the East. Now, in the year 1204, its treasures lay scattered, its holy relics stolen, its power broken. Among the victors, Venice emerged with more than riches. It emerged with an empire shaped not of vast territories, but of harbors, fortresses, and sea lanes. This new empire would be called the Stato da Mar, the state of the sea. It was unlike any realm Europe had ever known. The kings of France or England ruled sprawling tracts of farmland. The Holy Roman Emperor claimed mountains, rivers, and cities, but Venice sought none of that. Venice wanted control of the sea itself. The merchants of the lagoon understood something their rivals did not. Land could be conquered and lost, but trade routes were the true veins of power. To hold them meant to control the flow of spices, silks, and precious metals that connected east and west. And so, while Crusader knights fought for castles and crowns, the Venetians quietly claimed the ports that linked the Mediterranean together. They chose carefully. Each acquisition was not random plunder, but part of a long chain of logic. One island would guard the route to another. One harbor would protect the passage to the next. Over time, a great necklace of Venetian stations was strung across the sea. At its heart lay Crete, the jewel of the Stato da Mar. Crete was immense compared to the tiny islands of the lagoon. It sat in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean, a stepping stone between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Whoever held Crete could control the sea lanes that connected Constantinople, Egypt, and the Levant. Venice seized it eagerly, fortifying its harbors and installing governors to rule in the name of the Republic. Crete became a vital base for Venetian merchants and war galleys. Its fertile land provided grain and wine, feeding both sailors and the hungry mouths of Venice itself. But more than food, Crete gave Venice presence. From its ports, Venetian ships could project power in every direction. To the north, Venice held ports along the Dalmatian coast, today's Croatia. These were stepping stones on the long journey down the Adriatic, ensuring that no rival fleet could threaten Venice's home waters. To the east, they took Euboea, an island off the coast of Greece, and a share of the Cyclades, the scattering of islands that dot the Aegean. Each new holding was fortified, not as a land to be farmed, but as a harbor to be defended. Farther afield, Venice claimed strongholds on the Ionian Islands, including Corfu, guarding the entrance to the Adriatic. They extended their reach to Negroponte, to Modon and Coron in the Peloponnese, ports that were known as the two eyes of the Venetian Empire, watching over the routes to Constantinople and Alexandria alike. Each station was tied back to Venice not by land but by sea. Messages, soldiers, and supplies traveled across the waves. The Stato da Mar was a web spun across water, its strands invisible but unbreakable. It was empire without farmland, dominion without fields, rule without a countryside. And yet, for all its strangeness, it worked. The wealth of the East flowed more securely than ever into the warehouses of the Rialto. Venetian merchants sailed under the winged lion banner, confident that wherever they dropped anchor, they would find a friendly garrison, a customs house, and a safe haven. But empire brought burdens as well as riches. Each island required soldiers, governors, and fortifications. The native populations did not always welcome their new masters. In Crete especially, Venetian rulers faced constant rebellion from the local Greeks, who saw the Venetians not as liberators but as occupiers. Uprisings flared again and again, and the Republic had to send troops from the lagoon to crush them. Still, the Venetians were patient. They were not conquerors who sought glory and swift victories. They were merchants who thought in terms of generations. Slowly, they wove their dominion into the fabric of the islands. Venetian noble families were granted estates in Crete and elsewhere, binding their fortunes to the new empire. Latin bishops were installed alongside Orthodox priests, symbols of a new order, though the old faiths endured. The Stato da Mar became a second Venice, a mirror of the lagoon state stretched across the sea. Its fortresses were built in the same angular style, its governors sworn to the same oaths. Its soldiers stood watch not for the sake of conquest, but for the security of trade. And always, behind it all, loomed the arsenal, ready to build new fleets at astonishing speed if rebellion or invasion threatened. The vision of the blind doge Enrico Dandolo had borne fruit. In the wake of the Fourth Crusade, Venice had not only enriched itself, but had carved out a new kind of empire. It was an empire that did not seek to rival France or Germany in land, but to eclipse them in wealth and influence. As the 13th century unfolded, Venice's hold on the eastern Mediterranean tightened. Its ships carried spices from Alexandria, silks from Constantinople, and grain from Crete. The wealth poured back to the lagoon, where palaces rose along the Grand Canal, their facades glittering with marble and mosaics. The city's merchants grew richer, its councils more powerful, and its people more confident. But empire always invites rivals. To the west, Genoa watched with envy and resentment. The Genoese had their own fleets, their own merchants, and their own ambitions in the eastern Mediterranean. Again and again, the two republics would clash. Their wars fought not on land, but across the waters, with galleys ramming, boarding, and burning under the hot Mediterranean sun day. For now, though, the Stato da Mar stood secure. Venice had built something no one else had imagined. A city born in mud and salt water had become the mistress of the sea. The marriage celebrated each year by the Doge was no empty ceremony. It was reality. The sea belonged to Venice, and Venice belonged to the sea. Night after night, Venetian galleys set out from the lagoon, their lanterns glowing in the dark waters, their holds filled with cargo bound for Crete, Constantinople, or Alexandria. And night after night they returned, bringing back the wealth of half the known world to a city that had no land, no army, and no king, but possessed the one thing that mattered most: mastery of the sea. Venice had always been a city balanced between two elements, water and stone. Its foundations rested upon wooden piles driven deep into the mud, its streets were canals, and its heartbeat was the lapping of the tide against marble steps. Yet by the 13th century, with the Stato da Mar stretched across the Mediterranean, the relationship between Venice and the sea deepened into something more than survival. The sea was no longer simply the barrier that protected the lagoon. It had become the lifeblood of an empire. Every dawn, the Riva degli Schiavoni stirred with activity. Dock workers rose from their wooden shacks, merchants bustled with ledgers in hand, and the smell of tar and pitch filled the air as caulkers prepared ships for departure. The arsenal worked without pause, its hammers ringing day and night, crafting planks, rigging, and nails for the next great fleet. From these slips emerged the galleys of Venice, lean vessels with sharp prows and high sterns, designed not for comfort but for speed and endurance. Each galley was a floating piece of the Republic, carrying her authority to the farthest reaches of the sea. Sailors came aboard with bundles of salted meat and dried biscuits, priests with their small chests of relics, captains with sealed instructions from the Senate. Cargo was loaded under careful watch: bolts of cloth, jars of wine, barrels of olive oil, and, more importantly, the silver and gold that would be exchanged for spices in Alexandria or Constantinople. For the merchants who invested in these voyages, each departure was a gamble. The sea could be generous, returning ships laden with pepper, cinnamon, and silk. But it could also be cruel, swallowing whole fleets in sudden storms or leaving them as prey to pirates who lurked along rocky coasts. Venetian law reflected this balance of risk. Profits were divided among investors and crew, but so too were losses, ensuring that the fortunes of many were tied together with each ship that set sail. The Stato del Mar provided the framework for this trade. Without safe harbors, without fortified islands, each voyage would have been fraught with danger. But with Corfu guarding the Adriatic, Crete commanding the mid-sea, and Modon and Coron watching over the approach to Alexandria, Venetian galleys could move with confidence. At each stop, the winged lion flew from towers and walls, a signal that the merchants of Venice were at home, even far from the lagoon. The rhythm of this empire was steady, almost seasonal. In spring, fleets gathered in the lagoon, sails repaired, hulls scrubbed clean, oarsmen recruited from across the Adriatic. By summer, the great convoys known as Mude departed in disciplined formation, their ships bristling with crossbows and marines to guard against attack. In autumn, they returned, sails heavy with cargo, holds filled with wealth that would spill into the markets of the Rialto. Winter was a time of repair, of reckoning, of counting profits and losses by the dim light of the counting houses. It was not only goods that moved along these routes, but people, stories, and ideas. Pilgrims bound for the Holy Land passed through Venetian ports, their prayers mingling with the chants of Orthodox priests and the calls of Muslim merchants. Scholars carried manuscripts, doctors carried herbs, and sailors carried tales of distant lands. Venice became not only a hub of commerce, but a crossroads of culture, where East and West touched hands, sometimes in peace, sometimes in rivalry. This flow of wealth transformed the lagoon itself. Palaces rose higher along the Grand Canal, faced with marble quarried from distant islands. Churches were adorned with mosaics that glittered in the light, each tile purchased by trade. The Doge's palace expanded, its halls echoing with the footsteps of envoys and merchants. Even the humblest citizen of Venice felt the touch of the sea in daily life, whether in the abundance of grain from Crete, the spices that flavored meals, or the coins that trickled down from the profits of the Mude. Yet the sea, for all its generosity, demanded constant vigilance. Fortresses had to be garrisoned, ships had to be maintained, and rival powers had to be watched with suspicion. Genoa, Pisa, and later the rising Ottoman Turks all sought to contest Venetian mastery of the waves. For every coin earned in trade, another was spent on defense. Still, Venice accepted this burden. For the Republic, the sea was not merely a route of profit. It was an identity, a calling, almost a sacred trust. Each year, in a ceremony dating back to the days of Doge Ziani, the Doge himself would sail out upon the Adriatic in the Bucentoro, a golden barge adorned with carvings and flags. There, before clergy and citizens, he would cast a ring into the water, symbolically marrying the sea. It was more than a ritual. It was a declaration that Venice and the sea were bound together, as inseparable as husband and wife. The people of Venice embraced this vision. Sailors sang songs of the sea as they hauled on ropes. Children played at naval battles in the shallow canals, and artisans carved the Lion of St. Mark into the prows of ships as a sign of divine protection. To be Venetian was to be part of a city that floated, not just physically, but in spirit, suspended upon the water that nourished and protected it. In the Stato da Mar, this bond found its fullest expression. Every fortress, every island, every harbor was an extension of Venice itself. They were not colonies in the sense of distant lands ruled from afar. They were reflections, fragments of the lagoons scattered across the Mediterranean, each tied by the invisible thread of loyalty to the Republic. And so, in the centuries after the fall of Constantinople, Venice grew not as a land power, but as a sea power, her heart beating in rhythm with the waves, her veins stretched across the waters, her lifeblood flowing through the harbors and islands of her maritime state. Night would fall on the lagoon, lanterns flickering along the quays, the sound of water slapping against stone. In the quiet, one could almost hear the heartbeat of the empire, not in the clamor of armies, nor in the roar of battle, but in the gentle, steady rhythm of the sea. No empire grows without meeting resistance. For centuries, Venice had stretched her hand across the sea, gathering islands, harbors, and trade routes into the careful web of the Stato da Mar. Yet she was not the only city to dream of ruling the Mediterranean. To the west, another republic, Genoa, rose with equal ambition and equal hunger. Where Venice looked east toward Constantinople, Alexandria, and the Levant, Genoa gazed south and west, toward Sicily, North Africa, and Iberia. But the sea is wide and yet never wide enough. Inevitably, the two powers collided, and when they did, their rivalry grew into one of the longest, fiercest contests in medieval history. The Venetians and the Genoese were alike in many ways. Both were republics ruled not by kings, but by councils of merchants. Both relied on trade more than farmland, their wealth tied to ships and markets rather than plows. Both built galleys that were swift and deadly, propelled by long banks of oars, designed to strike hard and fast. Both were stubborn, pragmatic, and fiercely proud. Yet they distrusted each other utterly. Venetian merchants accused the Genoese of treachery and deceit. Genoese merchants muttered that the Venetians were arrogant and greedy. Their enmity was not only of words, but of deeds. Time and again, their ships met on the open sea, their quarrels erupting into boarding, ramming, and fire. The rivalry began with trade. Genoa had secured privileges in the Crusader states and in the ports of the Levant, threatening Venetian routes. Venice, in turn, established strongholds in Crete, Corfu, and Constantinople itself, closing doors to Genoese merchants. Each gain by one was seen as a loss by the other. The Mediterranean was not wide enough for both to flourish without conflict. By the 13th century, skirmishes grew into full wars. Fleets clashed in the Aegean, in the Tyrrhenian Sea, and even as far as the Black Sea. Battles were chaotic, filled with smoke, shouts, and splintering wood. Galleys rammed into one another with iron prows, grappling hooks flew across the waves, and sailors fought hand to hand with swords and crossbows upon slippery decks. To the victors went the prizes, captured cargo, ransomed crews, and control of coveted ports. One of the fiercest encounters came at Crozzola in the year 1298. A vast Venetian fleet, commanded by Andrea Dandolo, met a Genoese force in the waters of the Adriatic. The battle raged for hours, oars shattering, sails burning, ships colliding in deadly confusion. At last, the Venetians suffered a devastating defeat. Thousands were captured, including a young man named Marco Polo, who had only recently returned from his journeys in the East. It was in a Genoese prison that he began dictating his tales, turning his misfortune into legend. Yet even defeat did not break Venice. The arsenal worked day and night, hammering out new galleys faster and stronger. Within months, fleets sailed again. For Venice, the sea was not a battlefield that could be abandoned. It was the very foundation of survival. To lose meant to rebuild. To rebuild meant to endure. The wars with Genoa drained treasure and blood, yet they also hardened Venice. Each conflict taught new lessons in shipbuilding, in tactics, in diplomacy. Each defeat forced adaptation. Each victory reinforced confidence. The rivalry became a crucible, shaping Venice into a power more resilient than before. And though battles were fought far from the lagoon, their echoes reached home. In the Piazza San Marco, citizens listened anxiously for news of fleets. In the workshops of the arsenal, wives and children of sailors waited as hammers struck sparks from iron. Each victory brought celebrations, each loss brought mourning. The rivalry was not distant. It was woven into the life of the city itself. The contest stretched for more than a century, flaring into open war, then settling into uneasy truce, only to rise again. Neither side could secure lasting dominance, for both were too strong and too stubborn. Yet slowly, over time, the balance shifted. Venice's control of Constantinople and her chain of fortified ports gave her a more stable base. Genoa, though fierce, often found herself overextended, her energy spent across too many fronts. By the 15th century, Genoa's strength began to wane. Internal strife and foreign domination weakened her republic, while Venice pressed onward. At last, the long rivalry faded, not with a single decisive victory, but with the steady endurance of Venice outlasting her rival. The Mediterranean, once a battlefield between two merchant republics, now tilted in favor of the city of the lagoon. Still, the memory of Genoa lingered. Venetians told tales of desperate battles, of narrow escapes, of captured sailors. The arsenal displayed captured prows, reminders of victories past. The rivalry had become part of Venetian identity, a story of struggle that proved the city's claim to mastery of the sea. In truth, Venice's greatest enemy was never only Genoa. It was the sea itself, vast, unpredictable, and merciless. Genoa was but a reflection of that larger struggle, a human mirror of the eternal contest between Venice and the waters that sustained her. By enduring Genoa, Venice proved not only her strength against rivals, but her resilience against the sea itself. And so, the rivalry passed into history. The galleys that once clashed under burning sun now lay rotted in forgotten harbors. The merchants who once cursed each other's names had long since turned to dust. Yet the story endured, quiet and steady, a reminder that Venice's greatness was not handed to her, but forged in rivalry, in danger, and in endless struggle upon the sea. Night fell upon the lagoon, and the waters reflected the light of lanterns swaying in the breeze. The war cries of Genoa were gone. What remained was silence, broken only by the sound of oars dipping into the water, the eternal rhythm of Venice, the city married to the sea. The sea had carried dangers, and rivals had tested her strength. But out of those centuries of struggle grew something else, a city at the height of wealth and splendor. Venice in her golden age was more than galleys and fortresses, more than wars and rivalries. She became a place of markets, of silk and spices, of palaces rising from the water, and of a rhythm of life unlike any other in the world. In the heart of the city stood the Rialto, a district of bridges, warehouses, and narrow streets where trade from across the world converged. Here one could walk through a market that was itself a map of distant lands. From Alexandria came pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg, their fragrances drifting through the stalls. From Damascus and Aleppo came silk and fine cotton, dyed in colors so deep they seemed almost alive. From Constantinople came carpets, ivory, and glassware of exquisite craft. From the Black Sea arrived grain, fish, and honey. From the north, merchants carried wool from Flanders, furs from Russia, and silver from Germany. The Rialto was never silent. Even at dawn, merchants arranged their wares, while porters carried bales from ships moored along the Grand Canal. Barges groaned under the weight of sacks filled with salt, wine, or sugar. The calls of traders rose above the crowd, each voice competing with another, each language mingling into a strange symphony. Greek, Arabic, Latin, German, and the Venetian tongue all overlapped, reminding every listener that this city was not one people alone, but many drawn together by trade. Wealth flowed through Venice like water, yet unlike other cities, her wealth was not locked behind palace walls. It was seen openly in the gondolas gliding along canals, their black hulls polished to a shine, in the facades of palaces lining the Grand Canal, their arches and columns carved in styles borrowed from Byzantium, Islam, and Gothic Europe alike, in the stones of the Piazza San Marco, where nobles walked beneath mosaics glittering with gold. The wealth of Venice was not only for princes. Even modest citizens lived with comforts rare elsewhere. A baker's home might be adorned with glass beads from Murano, glowing like jewels in the light. A carpenter might wear a belt fastened with brass imported from Germany. A merchant's family might dine from plates painted with patterns copied from the East. In Venice, wealth trickled down, not evenly, but more widely than in most of Europe. And always, behind the splendor, was the arsenal. The great shipyard, vast as a city itself, continued to beat like a heart. Galleys were built in orderly sequence, each part fashioned by skilled hands, each hammer strike echoing across the lagoon. The arsenal did not only build warships. Merchant galleys were launched as well, designed for speed, built to carry cargo swiftly across seas. For Venice, trade was the lifeblood, and the arsenal ensured the veins remained open. In the markets, coins changed hands endlessly. The Venetian ducat, struck in gold of unmatched purity, became trusted across Europe and the East. Merchants from distant lands accepted it without question. A ducat in Cairo, in Damascus, in Bruges, or in London carried the same weight. Trust in Venice's coin became as valuable as the coin itself, binding markets across continents into one. Life in the city followed the rhythm of trade. At dawn, bells rang from churches, and gondolas began to move along the canals. Markets opened, their stalls laden with goods. By midday, nobles might gather in the Piazza San Marco, listening to petitions or discussing new ventures. In the evening, music floated from palaces where feasts were held. Torches flickered on the canals, reflecting in the dark waters. Even the poor, though burdened by labor, shared in the rhythm, their lives tied to the wealth flowing around them. Venice's wealth was not only material, it was also cultural. Painters filled canvases with images of saints and scenes of the city, their works luminous with color. Sculptors carved stone facades with angels, lions, and saints, each figure both ornament and story. Glassmakers in Murano experimented with forms and colors, creating goblets, beads, and mirrors that dazzled the wealthy of Europe. Musicians played in chapels and palaces, their notes echoing across stone halls. Even the humblest procession through the streets was accompanied by music and color. Yet beneath all the splendor was calculation. Venetian wealth was not reckless. The Republic was guided by councils that weighed risks, balanced trade, and sought to avoid ruin. Nobles might dress in silk, but they knew the price of pepper by the ounce. They might build grand palaces, but each investment was measured carefully. The Republic itself was like a merchant, cautious and deliberate, always watching, always counting. The golden wealth of Venice was not permanent. It depended on ships reaching ports, on alliances being kept, on wars being avoided or won. But for centuries, the city balanced these risks with remarkable skill. While kingdoms rose and fell, Venice remained steady, her wealth flowing quietly, her streets alive with trade, her canals reflecting both moonlight and torchlight. It was in this golden age that Venice became not merely a city, but a vision, admired and envied across Europe. Travelers wrote of her wonders, poets praised her beauty, kings and emperors sought her alliances. For those who arrived by sea, passing between the long arms of the Lido and into the lagoon, the first glimpse of domes, towers, and palaces rising from the water seemed almost unreal, a city of marble and gold, floating upon the sea. And so the wealth of Venice endured, generation after generation, not only as coins in chests or goods in warehouses, but as a way of life. A life measured in tides, in markets, in festivals, in the glow of lanterns upon water. A life unlike any other, shaped by trade, sustained by the sea, and made brilliant by the vision of a people who believed their city was destined to shine. Night returned again to the lagoon. Lanterns swayed on gondolas, and the sound of distant music drifted across the canals. In the silence, the wealth of Venice was not a shout but a whisper, steady and calm, like the tide itself. The wealth of Venice shimmered in the light of the lagoon, yet even in the brightness of her golden age, shadows began to lengthen. History seldom allows one city to rule the seas forever. Beneath the splendor of palaces and the constant hum of trade, change was stirring in places far beyond the reach of gondolas and galleys. It began slowly, like the faint sound of thunder on a distant shore, but the storm would grow. To the east, across the endless waters of the Mediterranean, a new empire had risen, bold and relentless. The Ottomans had seized Constantinople, once the proud capital of Byzantium, and transformed it into Istanbul, their own imperial heart. The fall of that city had shaken all of Europe. For Venice, it was more than a shock. It was a blow to the foundation of her trade. The roots that once linked the Republic to the riches of the East now lay in the hands of a formidable rival. The Ottomans were not merely conquerors of land. They were masters of trade themselves, commanding routes through Asia, the Levant, and North Africa. Their ports bustled with activity. Their fleets grew stronger, their soldiers disciplined, their sultans determined. Venice, once accustomed to dealing with weakened powers and divided states, now faced a single, powerful empire that could match her ships, her merchants, and her ambition. The rivalry was not always war. Often it was negotiation, a careful dance of treaties, tariffs, and temporary truces. Venetian envoys, draped in simple black robes, traveled to Istanbul to bargain with sultans and viziers. They carried gifts, gold, and the quiet skill of diplomacy. Sometimes agreements were reached, and trade flowed once more. But peace was never certain. The shadow of conflict always lingered, and every treaty carried the weight of suspicion. At the same time, a different shadow fell from the west. Across the Atlantic Ocean, new worlds had been discovered. Spain and Portugal sent ships beyond horizons once thought impassable, returning with silver, gold, and spices carried not from the old overland routes, but from across the seas. What had once flowed through Venice, carried by caravan and galley, now traveled on great ocean-going ships to Lisbon, Seville, and later Antwerp and Amsterdam. The Republic watched these changes with caution. Venice had always relied on control of the Mediterranean. Her galleys were swift, but they were built for inland seas, not the vast oceans. She had no harbors on the Atlantic, no colonies in the Americas, no foothold along the coasts of Africa. The tide of trade was shifting, and though Venice still shone brightly, her glow now competed with new lights rising in the west. Within the city, nobles debated these dangers. Some urged bold ventures, new fleets, new alliances, even attempts to send Venetian ships beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the open Atlantic. Others counseled caution, preferring to strengthen what Venice still held: the routes to the Levant, the control of Adriatic waters, the mastery of Mediterranean islands. The councils argued late into the night beneath the gilded ceilings of the Doge's palace, their voices echoing against the marble walls. Yet the ordinary life of the city seemed unchanged. Markets still overflowed with goods. The Rialto Bridge still bustled with merchants counting coins. The Piazza San Marco still glowed with mosaics. Gondolas still drifted beneath moonlight, their oars slicing gently through the water. For the people of Venice, the shadows on the horizon were distant. But for the merchants, the shipbuilders, and the councils, they were impossible to ignore. The arsenal continued to build ships, but now more resources were needed to defend than to expand. Wars with the Ottomans drained the treasury. Battles in the eastern Mediterranean claimed lives and vessels. At sea, Venetian galleys met Ottoman fleets in clashes that shook the waters. Sometimes victory favored the Republic, often it did not. Every loss weakened Venice's grip. Every defeat reminded her that the age of easy dominance was passing. Beyond war, there was also disease. The Black Death had long since swept through Europe, leaving scars that never fully healed. Plague returned again and again, carried by ships into the crowded canals of Venice. Wealth could not always shield against illness. Nobles and commoners alike fell ill. Entire households vanished in silence. Each outbreak weakened the city further, reminding its people that even the most powerful state was fragile when faced with forces beyond its control. Still, Venice endured. She did not collapse in a single moment. She did not vanish when the Ottomans advanced or when Portugal opened routes around Africa. Instead, she adapted, shifted, and survived, though never with the same brilliance as before. She remained a crossroads, a city of trade, art, and diplomacy, even as others began to eclipse her. For travelers arriving by sea, the first glimpse of domes and towers rising from the lagoon still seemed miraculous. The Piazza San Marco still dazzled with mosaics of gold. The ducal palace still stood proud, its arches and columns intricate as lace, yet behind the splendor lay unease. Venice, once the unrivaled queen of the seas, was becoming a city among others, not above them. The shadows grew longer with each passing century. The Ottomans pressed harder, Spain and Portugal grew wealthier, and new northern powers like the Dutch and the English began to sail boldly into seas Venice had never touched. The age of Mediterranean supremacy was fading, and with it the dominance of the Republic. But for now, in the calm of the lagoon, under the light of the moon, Venice still shone. The waters still lapped gently against her palaces. The gondolas still moved quietly through the canals. The people still lived in rhythm with the tides. The city endured, not yet fallen, not yet forgotten, but slowly, steadily, walking toward a future where shadows would deepen and her brilliance would be tested as never before. Night settled again across the lagoon. Lanterns glimmered on the water, reflections trembling in the ripples. The shadows on the horizon were unseen by most, yet history was already turning. The city of Venice, proud and radiant, was beginning to face the long twilight of her power.